Alright guys, I'm recounting an old experience of mine today that happened at Boomtown Festival back in 2019. For those that don't know, Boomtown is a festival near Winchester in the south of England, and it's held annually in early August. Around 76,000 people come here, and it's easily one of the greatest festivals in the UK, if not the world, thanks to its immersive storytelling, spectacular environments, so much attention to detail in the way that music is presented. It's not just like a generic festival. Definitely recommend going if you live in the UK, or if you're abroad, get over it. It's probably one of the only reasons to come to the UK. I mean, we've not got much to offer, like. So yeah, it's a pretty remarkable place, and each year the whole festival becomes more imaginative as the story unfolds over chapters that expand upon the themes and ideas of the previous year. Music is spread across multiple districts, and they represent scenes from all over the globe and throughout the underground. Everything from reggae, roots, folk, ska, metal, punk to techno, hip hop and house. But the highlight perhaps has got to be the DJ scene, at least for me and my mates, namely drum and bass. Anyone who's into psychedelics or mind-altering chemicals like MDMA knows just how amazing it is to dance to electronic music. It can often be a highly meditative and touching experience to revel in the amplified sensory stimulation amongst thousands of other kind and like-minded people, as well as some of your best mates. It's really a sight to behold. So around 16 of us all arranged to meet up to shred our minds and ignite our hearts for 4 days of non-stop raving action. First of all, the trip down was marred by some serious bumps in the road. Our friend was actually Ketty and couldn't drive his car for quite a while, and we had to pull over and rest at this stop. But that ended up sorting itself out, thankfully. And then we went down south and we ended up in this shop, and my mate Buckers ended up he literally just sort of touched this woman's wing mirror, and then we came into this shop, and before we knew it, there was this big guy, and he was like, "You have disgraced my mother's car. How dare you? I'm going to report you to the authorities," and all this shit. And then he literally followed us around the shop, and then his mum came in and started screaming at us, saying like we were oppressing her. Fucking madness, really. And then when we got to the festival, the security was pretty tight, and Buckers actually got sniffed out by the dogs, and thankfully he didn't have anything on him, but his entrance into the festival was delayed by a few hours due to the search procedures, but everyone else I think got in fairly smoothly. So once we all united, we set up shop on a hill near the techno stage called Nucleus. It was an awesome view of the meticulously detailed and colourful juggernaut of a stage, and we'd camped there the year before, and I didn't go in 2017, but all of my other mates camped at this spot as well, and it's really good spot. But the thing was, in 2018, it was a bassline and drum and bass stage, so that was more up our alley. We weren't the biggest fans of techno. But being on the other side of the festival meant we got to see more of the districts, and it also made the exodus to Relic all the more dramatic, that being the main stage for drum and bass. A few hours after we'd set up camp, one of the sound engineers smelt the odour of weed emanating from our massive 10-man tent which I was going to sleep in, and instead of reprimanding us, he instead began to roll up and natter with us for a while. It was pretty sound. But it wasn't until several joints deep into the smoke up that he whipped out some fruit pastels that had LSD dosed onto them. He was unsure of the dosage though. I already had some tabs on me, so I declined the offer, but a few of my mates took some off him, namely Keith, who will play a part in the story later on. Things were off to a great start, and we engaged in all our usual festival antics throughout the day and into the night. We saw so many wonderfully weird people, watched an amazing amount of mucky sets, and suffocated in the intoxicating aura that Boomtown exudes from every orifice. It wasn't until the next day that things began to take a turn for the worse though. The Friday of the festival was plagued by rampant storms that were battering the UK. Furious winds had obliterated people's camps and strewn them halfway across the festival. 3 of our friends actually came back to the campsite to find their tent completely flat, so the Friday was already in a bit of disarray to begin with. But despite this, the atmosphere had not dulled and everyone was in great spirits. Relic was due to open today, and we all made a plan to fully link up everyone in our group and embark on a mass exodus to the drum and bass realm to see one of the best MCs called DRS, who was performing with the DJ LSB. It was a big fucking deal. So me, Squilkus, Keith and Keka decided to dose up on some acid. Keka and Keith had one of their fruit pastels, whilst I had a tab and a half that I assumed totalled up to 250 UG. I also gave the other half of the tab I split to Squilkus. He didn't fancy taking a fruit pastel and just wanted a mild trip. Me and my then-to-be girlfriend, Elle, spent the first few hours before the set wandering the festival, checking out all the hidden nooks and crannies, discovering an abundance of strange and interesting performance arts and niche music, whilst occasionally fueling up on some ket. It was a great come-up to the trip. Once we all linked up, we were all suitably dosed up to embark on our journey together. A few hours later on our trip to Relic, all of us who had taken acid were on the cusp of the peak, and things began to become very strange. As I was walking, I would occasionally hallucinate naked people walking in between the crowd. At first I thought this was real, but then I noticed that all these people were people that I knew from back home. They would stare at me and pass through people's bodies, and then when I looked back, they would just disappear into thin air. This was especially weird, but I was so far gone that I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. To our dismay, as we arrived at Relic, we were informed by the staff that the stage had to be shut down for the night due to the severe winds. Earlier in the day at Shy FX, the opening act, part of the stage had flown off into the crowd and the set was cut short, so there was obviously a risk of the stage fully falling over, which would have been pretty fucked up. We were all absolutely gutted that we couldn't go to Relic. This was the first proper night on the Friday, and it was the first and only time everyone fully grouped up to see an act together. This threw the group into disarray, since we couldn't all agree on a place to visit together. We all splintered off and went to see other stuff on that we were interested in. I was cut off from Squilkus, Keka and Keith, and went to go to Earache Factory with Elle. She absolutely loves metal, as do I, although not quite as much as I do now. I wasn't really into extreme metal back then. So I decided to hit up Crossfaith, a Japanese metalcore band, who were just about to start playing. The night before this, I was on 2CB and me and Elle went to see Napalm Death, an extremely mucky band who pioneered the grindcore genre. I'd never heard their music, but knew who they were, so you can imagine the shock and terror I experienced whilst being at the front of the audience, getting thrown about by the constant mosh pits whilst on 2CB. It was fairly chaotic, and despite enjoying the music, tripping whilst being banged into every other minute was pretty dire, and I had to leave. So I had it in my mind that this time would be different, and I wanted to make it up to Elle for bailing the night before due to being too fucked up. Funnily enough, the same thing happened again, if not worse this time. We went straight to the front whilst I was peaking, and the crowd was even more wild than the last night. I looked into Elle's eyes and I was obliterated by kaleidoscopes of unending magnitude. Some guy with a horn then bounced up to us and handed it to me and Elle, and we took a swig, not realising it was whiskey. This was truly suffering in its purest form. After 20 minutes into the set, the band beckoned everyone to run onto the stage with them, and I tightened with absolute fear. Suddenly hundreds of people came storming onto the stage behind us, and I literally felt my mind snap into survival mode, and I darted straight out of the extremely dark and sweaty pit, praying to God that I wouldn't get trampled to death on the way out. I made it out and noticed that this jolt of adrenaline had basically triggered an ego death-like experience in me. As soon as I left the crowd, I became distinctly aware of the illusory nature of the self, and how everyone and everything I looked at was just fragments of my own mind. I felt utterly certain that I was imagining everything, and as I would shift my vision around, I interpreted that my lens into reality was reminiscent from your cone of vision in a game like Metal Gear Solid or Minecraft, wherein everything that is being seen from the player's perspective is being rendered so that you can see it, whilst everything outside of that cone, like say the environment behind the player, is just information or data that can solidify into something material when it is perceived. This idea felt ridiculously true, and it started to make sense why we actually engineer games in this way, because is this how reality is constructed via the mind through consciousness? I started to have deep insights into how I was creating reality, which was all just another word for infinite consciousness, which my ego currently is an infinitesimally small fraction of. Elle came out of the stage and I recognised the deep love that was brewing inside of me for her, and that had been catalysed by coming to Boomtown and spending more time together. As soon as my eyes caught hers and watched her smile, I knew that one day this woman would be my partner. It was remarkably beautiful, as is she. Although I was far too psyched out to even begin to explain what was going on and how I felt about her, without sounding like some mental patient, so I just told her that I was panicking and needed some air. She was upset that we had to miss the rest of the set, but she enjoyed just being with me in what would have been a funny sight to behold from her end. We walked around and I began to level out and retain my ego, as I observed the towering buildings and absorbed the cacophony of sounds. The sense of other began to solidify in my mind due to this, and I was able to escape a full ego death, which I imagine could have been disastrous whilst out and about in the festival. However, I was still plagued by occasional nightmarish hallucinations, like the dead people I knew from before, except this time they appeared like living corpses, shambling around and disappearing into thin air, locking me dead in the eyes with their gaze. Me and Elle checked out one of the random tents near Earache Factory and found a band who mainly performed with bagpipes. The music was really interesting, but I was scarred during the performance when I noticed that each of the bandmates had their vision directly fixed onto me, peering into my soul. This was creepy as fuck, but I managed to somehow retain my sanity throughout the set. After this I was sufficiently weirded out, yet somehow things began to get even weirder when I started to feel like I was influencing Elle's actions via my mind. I would perceive her as not talking for ages and only reacting to something when I spoke or pointed something out, and it was so precise that it felt as if I was her. It was as if she was a doll that was directly linked up to my psyche and perfectly responded and reacted to me so as to give the illusion that she was an actual self that is separate from me. This was all happening whilst being drenched in the sweet bassy woods emanating from a jungle set that was being played in one of the forested areas. Boom is over 100 acres in size, so it's easy to get lost amongst all of the different districts and areas within them. Because in each one of these areas there's buildings, you can go in a building, this building leads somewhere else, there's tunnels, there's places you don't even think are places, and you go into them and you're somewhere else. It can be pretty overwhelming, but in the best sense possible. It's an absolute sight to behold. So unfortunately, this is exactly what happened. We ended up getting lost, and we tried to find our way back to their camp to recuperate after my traumatic reaction to Crossfaith. But we ended up in a part of the festival we'd never even seen before, with hollowed out trees and hammocks littered everywhere. It was like a hippie retreat almost. This wasn't a problem though, seeing as we were enjoying ourselves. We took some time to chill out here and indulge in some ket whilst we basked in the trippy atmosphere of the lush and vivid environments. This group of lads came up to us whilst we were relaxing in the tree and started speaking in an Australian accent. although I couldn't quite make out a word of what they were saying and replied extremely basically like, "Yeah man, I get you," and "Yeah, definitely mate," when I had absolutely no clue what they're on about. I think they noticed I was pretty goners as Elle took over the talking until they left. I told her I was surprised to meet some Australian people at Boom, but she left me flabbergasted when she told me they weren't speaking in an accent at all. It was just another one of my hallucinations. At this point I was so fucked that I just had to laugh at how distorted my perceptions had actually become. This idea of physical reality was interpolating with the realms of imagination and producing a dreamlike experience of what I know as the real world. It was mind-blowing. Every time I've had an ego death, it had been building upon this insight into the dreamlike nature of reality and how imagination is so infinite in its power that it can literally dream something like what we know as the physical, material world into existence. With this revelation came the beginning of the come down. I managed to guide us back to the camp during this period and finally grouped up with a lot of the people who had been split up with before. We all shared our crazy experiences and journeys we'd been on in the hours since we all split up before DRS. It turned out that Squilkus, Kecker and Keith had all been together during their peaks, and each had an exceptionally strange experience, namely Keith, who had reverted back into some primal state of being during his ego death, snarling about like a madman. He also shared a similarity he had between me and my trip. To my surprise, he had also hallucinated dead people that he knew as if they were living entities, and also experienced totally unreal perceptions of having been on a spiral-like theme park ride that he wasn't even sure was real, but was sitting next to one of our friends who had passed away a few years ago. It sounded nightmarish, but we both agreed that our profound trips had ultimately been positive and would be another stepping stone towards understanding the nature of reality itself. Funnily enough, Squilkus told me that the half-tab I gave him was the strongest half-dose of acid he had ever taken, and was on the brink of an ego death throughout the peak. This made me realise why my trip had been so utterly mental. The dose of the tabs must have been at least double what I assumed they had been. This, also coupled with the fact that me, Keith and Squilkus had been on a consciousness-expanding mission for several years prior to this, and that as you start to understand more about reality, you can become more sensitive to psychedelics, and lower doses you would initially use recreationally, like we did back in the day at sessions and raves and other festivals when we were younger, can become mystical and profound as your own consciousness begins to evolve. So taking one tab now would be like taking 4 tabs back in the day. So all in all, it was a mind-bogglingly weird trip, but would end up serving as the basis for what would become expectant of trips in the future. Once you've glimpsed into the true nature of reality, psychedelics are forever changed, and the days of abusing them recreationally at festivals becomes unsustainable the beginning of your first mystical experience. The rest of the festival was informed by this experience. Each time I would ingest a mind-altering chemical, I was brought back to the vision of the cone of perception I experienced during my trip, how everything in my field of senses is being materialised through them via my mind. It helped me to see that so many of the things I fear and reject are actually a part of myself, and exist in order to be integrated and accepted into the whole of reality, with which I am a part of. So if I can't love myself, I could never love reality. It also sparked the blossoming of mine and Elle's relationship, who I would end up being with in the next few months, and am still happily partnered with to this day. I hope you enjoyed this glimpse into one of my nutty festival experiences. If you'd like to hear more of the wacky stuff me and my mates have gotten up to at festivals and raves over the years, let me know and I'll be sure to share more of them in the future. Peace out, guys.